In John chapter 5, I'm going to look at the entire chapter and consider this third miracle of Jesus, which takes place during the second feast. And it's an unnamed feast. But the occasion for this is quite interesting to note as you look through it, that the story of the man's healing almost is a provocative decision by Jesus to create conflict, so that in the second half of this chapter, and that's why I want to do the entire chapter together, all 47 verses, he's going to focus for the first time in a long discourse about his relationship with his Father. So beginning in verse 1, after these things, which goes back to chapter 4, and the story of the Samaritan woman and the movement from Samaria back to Galilee and the healing of the nobleman's son, we see that Jesus is going to move once again from the region up to Jerusalem. There was a feast of the Jews. There are in the Gospel of John 6 feasts. 3 times the Passover is mentioned. There's going to be a feast of dedication, a feast of booths, and then this unnamed feast. So it's interesting that John, which I believe who would know what this feast was, doesn't mention it. And it highlights once again that feasts are insufficient for the worship of God when Jesus has been revealed as the completion of all feasts. So the story, and I'm going to separate it out from verse 1, is continuing in verse 2. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porticos. This is very significant. The sheep gate is on the north side of the temple area. The sheep gate is a one-way gate. Sheep come in, and they're used for sacrifice, and they don't go out. It's interesting to note here that John says it's in Hebrew Bethesda. There's a lot of assumption that this book is written for a Hebrew audience or a Jewish audience. But in this case, if he has to offer an explanation, then it obviously extends beyond that audience and includes non-Hebrews, non-Jews. So the place has 5 porticos. In these, this pronoun would refer to the plural of the 5 porticos, apparently. In these lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered. Note here that there's a bracket. This bracket is going to extend all the way down to the end of verse 4. The New American Standard uses brackets to indicate a passage that might have some questions concerning the authenticity of the inclusion of the section because of some manuscripts that don't include this passage. So out of tradition, very often the New American Standard will include the passage even though the manuscript evidence may suggest that it ought not to be included. It provides some background information about the belief of the people at the time, or at least what some others felt the people believed at the time, that would explain a little bit more of the story. This is going to be significant when we get to John chapter 8 and the woman who was caught in adultery and they wanted her to be stoned. That section is also going to be in dispute by the brackets, indicating that the possibility exists that story was an addition added later. Nevertheless, the New American Standard editors include this passage. So now reading. So these people who were sick, blind, lame, and withered, waiting for the moving of the waters, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after the stirring of the water, stepped in, was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. There's quite a paradox mentioned here, that there's a lot of people described by these 4 conditions: sick, blind, lame, and withered. And these 4 levels, and there may have been more, but at least that's the circumstance of what John reveals, that the first, whoever then first stepped in, was made well. It would indicate that whoever was second is not made well. So the quickest into the water is healed. Every one of these conditions is preventative, or excuse me, is prohibitive and would prevent someone from healing themselves. The first end is healed. So the healing is not based on the water or the stirring up of the water, it's based on speed. So the conflict is that only one is healed and everybody else is lost. And the assumption is can any of those people meet the condition of moving themselves anyway? Whoever then first stepped in was made well. Do they have the ability to step in? It's going to be very significant, and we consider now verse 5. A man was there who had been ill for 38 years. Immediately my mind goes to 38 years thinking, okay, what other time period in Israel's history would have such a lengthy time involved? My first thought is the Exodus experience was 40 years. And sure enough, if we consider that the Exodus experience of 40 years was reflective of the 40 days the spies were gone, that actually occurred when they came back in unbelief, and God was to create a delay of 40 years. The event actually took place, the spies being gone, in Numbers 13. But it appears to me that in Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, the timing of the spies' report was in the second year of their wandering. So that would seem to me that there were 2 years into it. A test comes to the Jewish people, and they don't trust the Lord. And as a result, they would wander for the next 38 years. That's Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. I'm not sure exactly if that's the case here. I don't want to conjecture too much, but I find a parallel worth noting that this chronic illness has gone on in this man's life for a long time. And he's incapable of healing himself. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been a long time in that condition, we don't know how Jesus knew that he had been there a long time in that condition, other than he's Jesus, he's omniscient, and he knows all things. But the recognition that the 38 is to carry the weight of, this is not a new condition. It's not an urgent thing to heal. But the question Jesus asked is quite interesting in light of the fact that he's been there a long time. Or he's been ill for a long time. We don't know how long he's been there. We know his condition, but not the length of his duration. He said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" It would seem to be obvious that he wants to get well because he's there, and he's not well. I'm always interested to note when God asks a question that he clearly knows the answer to, it solicits the depth of someone's condition to respond to it. Jesus many times will ask questions, all of which he knows the answer to engage the person to describe their condition with more detail, and to solicit the opportunity that if your desire is real, then you'll do what he commands. So in response to Jesus' question, the sick man, verse 7, answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another steps down before me." The implication here, he's second or third or fourth and not healed. So it's very interesting to note that this man who can't do it himself has no one. He has no vicarious help in getting him into the pool to be healed. Apparently he's done this for years, but he still lays in wait, hoping that someone or somehow the circumstance would change and he would be healed. And now it happens in verse 8. Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet, and walk." 3 simple commands. Get up, pick up, and walk. In such a short order, after all of the time that this man has endured his condition, Jesus uses very few words just 8 in the English edition here, and changes the man's life. Immediately the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. I'm going to break the text here. There's several different ways to approach this, just to highlight the fact, whether you break it out and you say, now it was the Sabbath on that day, and put this at the back end, or just to hold it out, because it's a very significant statement in light of the fact, back to verse 1, there was a feast of the Jews. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and this event takes place on the Sabbath day. Just consider just these 9 verses. This man's condition has been chronic for 38 years. There's nothing urgent about healing him on any day. It seems to me that the timing of this miracle, and not to lose the fact that this is a legitimate miracle of healing someone who has been in a terrible condition for a number of years, it appears by the conclusion of verse 9, it was the Sabbath on that day. Once again, something significant occurs around the number 7. This is the 7th day, the Sabbath day. Jesus' activity is divine, and Jesus' healing is divine, because he's God. And what he does on the Sabbath day is to change someone's life. It seems to me that there have been many other days he could have done this. He could have done it the day before or the day after. Why would he do it on the Sabbath day? Why would he do it during a feast? I'm under the impression that as you consider the scriptures and you look at the timing and the circumstance, it's important to ask the question, why would he do it now? Given the fact that there's going to be a major dispute that arises because of the nature of this, and we'll see it in just a moment, I believe that Jesus intentionally performed this miracle to solicit a dispute with the Jews so that he could reveal his relationship to the Father. And John highlights this miracle to once again demonstrate that Jesus is God, and he is going to present how that revelation is life-changing. In this case, the man, ill or lame for 38 years, has been healed. So now more detail will follow about that story. Verse 10. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Pick up your pallet and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Pick up your pallet and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Now, I'm going to take the text here as I look at this and break it out, because I think there's a scene change. The discourse between the Jews and the man who was healed has been completed. He doesn't know who he was, just the fact that he was healed. Fascinating to consider that they're more interested on who the identity of the man is that apparently broke the Sabbath rather than what he actually did on the Sabbath. The Jews are focused on the man carrying his pallet. He says, "I was told to carry my pallet." Well, now he's indicted someone else, and in verse 12 they want to know who it is who said, "Pick up your pallet." Someone who is advocating breaking the law by their standard. So they don't know who it is. He had slipped away at the end of verse 13. There was a crowd in that place. So, verse 14, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple. John demonstrates that Jesus was looking for him, or comes across him, in the temple. It's the second feast and the second time Jesus is going to engage a conversation with the Jews about events concerning the temple during a feast. But now it's just Jesus and the man, and he said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." There is a connection between the man's experience and his lack of healing, his infirmity, being lame, and the relationship of sin. Much is often made that our illnesses are tied to sin. Sometimes it's very true, but we see it here that do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. We have to acknowledge, even though we don't know the fullness of it, that there is a relationship often between sin and illness. And Jesus notes that for us here. The man went away in verse 15 and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Not sure why the man was so eager to tell the Jews. They had asked him. Maybe he was under compulsion by virtue of their question, but also it's important to note that this man testifies about who the person was who made him well. Very personally, I would be very interested to share how my condition of 38 years was alleviated, and I would love to be able to talk about who it was that did that for me. And if anyone would ask me, I would surely tell them. So it appears that as Jesus found the man, so the man finds the Jews to share the story. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus. We don't know how or what that looks like, but evidently they were attacking him or challenging him because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." I want to split the verse again here, the section, because it gives us a reason, an explanation. For this reason, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but now a second indictment, also calling God his own Father, as he said here in verse 17, "My Father." I'm going to take this out and ignore that. They were seeking all the more to kill him, but he was breaking the Sabbath and considering that God was his own Father, making himself equal with God. And I want to highlight this. It can be looked upon as a continuation of verse 17, but my eye is attracted to the fact that we see with more clarity what is the Jewish motivation for the persecution. So I want to separate that out. You may not want to do that. Starting in verse 19, though, there's a new section. And this is a long section. I'm just going to highlight the fact and come back to what Jesus is going to do with this conflict. So, starting now in verse 19, "Therefore Jesus answered them," and we're not going to see any further challenge from the Jewish leaders. We're not going to hear from the man anymore. The miracle is complete. His testimony about who Jesus is to the Jews has been sufficient to focus the concentration of this passage now on what Jesus is going to say to the Jews about who he is and his relationship to the Father. So in verse 19, "Therefore Jesus answered and was saying to them, Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing." It's a very fascinating statement that Jesus is observing his Father and he's doing what the Father does. Notice, for whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner. I'm fascinated with this notion that Jesus Christ was watching his Father, and I'm going to be careful to use this language, and I don't want to denigrate any way, but he was mimicking what his Father was doing. We often talk about being in God's will, to do as the Son would do. The line, "What would Jesus do?" of 20 years ago was very popular and became too clichéic, and it became a marketing device. But the real statement appears to be is, what would the Father do? But not what would he do, but Jesus knows what he was doing. So he was doing so in like manner. Verse 20, "For the Father loves the Son and shows him all things that he himself is doing." This passage is powerful to consider, that love reveals activity. For the Father loves the Son and shows him. The Father is the subject of the action. He loves and he shows all things that he himself is doing. The Father has revealed himself to the Son, and what we're discovering is the Son is revealing himself to his people. "The Father will show him greater works than these, so that you will marvel." You would expect, or at least as I read this, I would expect that the Son would marvel. But Jesus says that the Father will show him, Jesus, greater works than these, and the Son will mimic those, which is what he's just told us he will do, is mirror what the Father is doing, and disciples will marvel. Now, the insertion here, in light of the fact that the healing of the lame man, is actually more dramatic. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son also gives life to whom he wishes. For not even the Father judges anyone, but he has given all judgment to his Son, so that all will honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has eternal life and does not come into judgment, but has passed out of death into life. Once again, Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. I'm going to stop reading now because I like to separate these statements, these propositional statements Jesus is making. And it appears to me that these statements are significant to see them in isolation, and they're worthy of subsequent study. Just to reiterate, I say to you, he who hears my word and believes him who sent me. The conditions here is hears the words of Jesus and believes upon the Father. It's not a two-step idea, it's one notion, that what Jesus is talking about is recognized to be sourced in the Father. And whoever believes what they hear is ultimately believing in the Father. And that belief results in eternal life. And once again, going back to what we saw back in John chapter 3, does not come into judgment because they've been judged already, but now they passed out of life into death by that belief. This one verse, 24, demonstrates that Jesus Christ is the mediator for a sinner to be reconciled to God his Father. To hear Jesus and to believe him is to believe in the Father who sent him. And that produces a faith that saves. So Jesus Christ is the mediator, reconciling us to his Father, which becomes the apostolic appeal, as the Apostle Paul will say in 2 Corinthians, that the apostles are ambassadors of God, urging, compelling, pleading that they be reconciled to God. They picked up the notion of Jesus. Whoever hears the words of Christ and understands that he is in his Father representing him, then that faith will save. So verse 25 harkens to the same idea, and I'd like to keep 25 through 29 together and then separate it out to note that he has given verse 27, where I think I picked up, he gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. This Son of Man phrase, and I need to focus on this, it showed up at the end of chapter 1, where the angels are ascending and descending on the Son of Man. This phrase is very prominent in Mark's Gospel. And this phrase is actually something that's rooted back in Daniel chapter 7. The Son of Man appears in the heavenly throne room, and he receives from the Ancient of Days the scroll, the authority to execute judgment. And the Son of Man then is pictured as a human who has divine authority. And in the case of Daniel chapter 7, he does that during the fourth beast, which is understood to be Rome. So when Mark portrays Jesus Christ as the Son of Man in 1045, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The shock is the Son of Man, who has divine authority in human form, does not execute that authority as expected, but actually serves and receives judgment, so that one day he receives the authority, as John chapter 5 verse 27 says, he has the authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. So this takes us back to an authority that Jesus has and maintains that he has not executed upon at this particular point. So the Son of Man here harkens back to Daniel chapter 7. Do not marvel at this, Jesus says, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth, those who did the good deeds to the resurrection of life, and those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. This section, verses 25 through 29, could be and has been described in the New American Standard editors as the two resurrections. It's really one resurrection with two destinies. So an hour is coming in which all the tombs will hear his voice, all those in the tombs. Looking at the gospel accounts, upon Jesus' resurrection, there were those in Jerusalem who experienced, it's very odd, who were called out of tombs. The earthquake broke those tombs open, and there were some, not every single person, but there were some who came alive. And of course, it would be assumed that they would die again. But a day is coming when there is a resurrection, and those who were deemed to have done good deeds will live, and those who had done evil deeds will be judged. It appears to be the judgment of Christ in the last days. This is an introduction to that idea. Now, verse 30, Jesus says, I can do nothing of my own initiative. I'm going to take out this attempt at correction because of the capital. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Now, that indicates this judgment that has been described earlier, and he's saying it's not self-willed. I'm doing what the Father has called me to do. I want to split this out because it stands as a subsequent explanation for the actions described in 25 through 29. Looking more at the rest of this circumstance, verse 31. If I alone testify about myself, my testimony is not true. Now, I'm going to jump ahead because one of the key words repeated several times through the end of the chapter is the word testify or testimony. We'll see it here. If I testify about myself. Jewish law required 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm a fact. A single voice testifying about something was not considered to be true. And that's why Jesus says, if I alone testify about myself, my testimony is not true. It's a conditional, understanding the law statement. So testimony is the circumstance here. There is another who testifies of me, and I know that the testimony which he gives about me is true. Now, I'm going to correct this little short mistake. It's a spacing issue, and I'm going to also hold off on the circumstance that I'd like to describe at the end of that. There is another who testifies of me, and I know that that testimony which he gives about me is true. So Jesus has admitted that if he's just by himself, what he's saying isn't true, but there's someone else who testifies of him. And that second person, and I'm going to clean all this up, that second person makes what Jesus says true because they agree with what he said. It's assumed here that it's the Father who has this another, but it's not just limited to the Father. And the rest of this chapter is very intriguing to see how John portrays these other witnesses to what Jesus says. I'm going to clean everything up as I'm looking through it now. And so starting in verse 33, just take a look at who are the people who are going to testify that Jesus is telling the truth. So he reminds them, you, speaking to the Jews, have sent to John, this is back in chapter 1, and he has testified to the truth. But the testimony which I receive is not from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was the lamp that was burning and shining, and you are willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John. For the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, testify about me that the Father has sent me. I see a transition here, and I want to highlight this. That initially he talks about that John has testified to the truth in verse 33. And then he starts talking about the works that he's doing. So there's a change. And it appears to me that it occurs in verse 36. So I want to drop that down because I want to focus now on John's testimony. So Jesus is highlighting that John has testified to what Jesus has said, describes him as the lamp that was burning and shining, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. But it continues. The testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John. And now, what is that testimony? The works which the Father has given me to accomplish. The very works that I do. We don't know all of them. We just know that Jesus is saying to the Jews, in light of the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, that work, but there are others. We've seen so far the water being changed into wine. We see the cleansing of the temple. We see the healing of the nobleman's son. But there were more works that aren't detailed by John. Well, those works, Jesus says, testify about me that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me is... Now, we're going to see a change here. So the first one who testifies to Jesus' truth is John. The second one who testifies, the second example, are the works that he's done. Now we see that the Father who sent me has testified of me. You've neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form. You do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe him who sent me. Now, as I look at this, the next thing in verse 39, you search the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me. There's another example that Jesus offers. So these two passages, now that I look at this, appear to go together, verse 36 through 38, that it is the Father who testifies on behalf of Jesus. But the way in which he does that, it's the works which Jesus is doing that the Father has given him to accomplish. And this is a strong statement. The Father who sent me has testified of me. You've neither heard his voice at any time or seen his form. You do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe him whom he sent. This is a statement that Jesus said, listen, the Father testifies of me, but you can't hear it, you haven't seen it, and you don't believe it. If you would do that, then you would understand that those things are true. It's clear here that Jesus is demonstrating that belief precedes revelation. So often people want to see things before they'll believe. Jesus demonstrates here that belief precedes revelation. So do you trust him or not? And if you don't, then you won't know that the Father has also testified that what Jesus says is true. As I mentioned just a moment ago, verse 39, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me. The scriptures is what he's describing. And you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. I do not receive glory from men, but I know you, that you do not have the love of God in yourselves. I have come in my Father's name. It's a very significant statement here. I've come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from one another, and you do not seek the glory that is from the one and only God? This is a strong statement that demonstrates that so often people are basing what they believe to be true on pure acclamation. You receive glory from one another. The praise of others is a great temptation in this world. But by contrast, those who seek glory from one another do not seek the glory that is from the one and only God. So verse 45, do not think that I will accuse you before my Father. The one who accuses you is Moses. Now, in the context, in verse 39, speaking to Jews, he's highlighting the fact that you know the Bible, you know the Scriptures. And those Scriptures testify about me. You're unwilling to come to me. So even though you believe the Scriptures and you search the Scriptures to know them, now he's going to invoke the author, the human author of those Scriptures, which is Moses, the law. So if you are interested in the Scriptures and you believe that it will produce eternal life, then you ought to believe in me. That's what Jesus is saying, but they don't. And because they don't believe, they fall under not affirmation or confirmation that they're students of the Bible. They actually fall under an accusation that Moses, in what he had written, accuses you, or accuses them in this case. And Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. So strong statement now that the Scriptures, bearing witness of who Jesus is, it's to note that Moses, as the author of the Pentateuch, the Torah, the law, everything in the law points to Jesus. And if you believe the law, then you would believe Jesus. The problem is, you can't really believe the law if you don't believe Jesus. That's what he's saying. So now he says in verse 47, but if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? In this particular point, Jesus has been very clear. He equates himself to be the focus of all that Moses had written. And anyone who searches the Scriptures and does not find Jesus does not know the Scriptures. If they do not believe, their study is in vain. And this concludes John chapter 5 from verses 1 all the way to 47. Just like to highlight that there are only 4 aspects of this, but it's extremely important to recognize what these 4 aspects are. This feast in Jerusalem is the second feast, of which there will be 6 in the Gospel of John, which is indicative of something is missing, because the book is all about 7s. We'll get to that later. The note about the time period in which Jesus does the Sabbath healing, that Sabbath healing is literally to create a dispute with the Jewish leaders, because he could have done it any other day, particularly when the man's been in the condition for 38 years. Jesus appears to me to be looking for a fight, and he got one. But what that really does is, we've demonstrated from verse 19 all the way through, there is no discussion, there's no questions. It's just Jesus explaining that their unbelief, in light of the fact of the evidence, Jesus points to the fact that the Father's going to testify on behalf of him. John the Baptist is going to testify on behalf of him. The works that he does testify on behalf of him, and the Scriptures testify on behalf of him. And they want to focus that he committed a sin because he healed a man, or commanded the man to take up your pallet and walk on the Sabbath. Jesus exceeds the Sabbath. Jesus exceeds all that the Jews were opposed to, or in this case, what they believed in with this feast. So what we discover is the revelation of Jesus' relationship with the Father is the focus of this discourse in John chapter 5. Appreciate the opportunity to share this chapter with you. And as I've tried to demonstrate, there are so many passages that could solicit further study that there is no way that we exhaust it in just the time we have with this video.